So, thanks to the organizers, you could have a meeting in Paris on almost anything and almost everybody would come to it. So thank you very much. William James once said that the art of being wise is to have the ability to overlook what should be ignored. And I'm going to take a stab at that in these remarks. It was this past year I was involved in a project where we were trying to build in morality to robots. And it was a short-lived project because it turns out it's rather easy. You just give the robot a rule and the robot follows it. So in fact, robots can be quite moral. It seems to be humans that have the problem. And so I'm going to try and address that today. And I've just come back from a couple of days in Washington, D.C., where everything is an acronym. Everything has an abbreviation, and then you're supposed to give it a meaning so that you can remember it, so you can do something about it. So here's my attempt at an acronym of what we're talking about. So we have brains that are utterly responsible for minds. We have minds that can downwardly cause and constrain brain mechanisms. And that interaction produces the ordinary behavior that you and I enjoy. And that there is a social layer above us that interacts with that mental layer as well. And finally, the question of personal responsibility is situated in the social layer. So to yank this back to what we're trying to understand here, as a father of 6, I thought I would just refresh with a little antidote to that last video that Itzhak showed. We could enjoy this for a couple seconds.
When I watch TV, it's just some shows that are pretend. And when you explore, you get more imagination than you already had. And when you get more imagination, it makes you want to go deeper in so you can get more and see beautiful things. Like the path, if it's a path, it could lead you to a beach or something, and it could be beautiful.
So how do we come from that to this is what's on the table here. And the way we can easily get to it in a way that's not direct to that group problem of evil is by looking at some evil cases of individual cases. And we certainly have the condition where there are bad brains and bad ideas. And we also have the condition where there are good brains but bad ideas. And there's a lot of attention given to the first category of bad brains and bad ideas, and Breivik is certainly an example of that. And people can study these matters. One of the original efforts launched in the United States was by Kent Keel at the University of New Mexico, where he convinced the governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, to buy him an MR scanner and move it into a prison. And over the course of many years, he's been studying the range of psychopathic behaviors, psychopaths, and being able to order them in terms of low, middle, and high psychopaths, and trying to understand their possibly abnormal brains in an attempt to understand whether this might be an excuse, a mitigating story when they come to their sentencing. And I would just say that, yes, they find stuff, and they're finding all kinds of things, and I think it's going to be held up. It doesn't particularly matter to me, or should it matter to you at this point, what parts of the brain are pathologically different than normals. There's going to be a story, It's a beginning story, but in 5 or 10 years from now, it'll be, I think, a very strong story and very helpful to the judicial system in trying to understand what to do. In the case of Breivik in particular, just this Sunday's New York Times had a long review by this author, this Norwegian author, on the nature of his condition, and he is a very disturbed young man. And then there's the case of the Boston bomber, who there's no indication that he's anything but a normal kid. So we have a situation where you have a good brain and a bad idea. And ideas have consequences, and that's why we argue about them. That's why we try to hash them out, because they can be incorporated into your psychological view of the world, and you can begin a process of self-justification, and these beliefs get deepened, and before you know it, you have a problem on your hands. And let me just speak about that, how that might all come about, and spend a second first on what I think is a fundamental question that neuroscience has to answer while it continues to move forward at a breathtaking way to understand brain mechanisms. And that's to distinguish between the concepts of supervene and supersede. Supervene is sort of the notion, the linear notion that A produces B, which produces C, and somewhere we're going to finally find out why the brain carries out particular acts in this sort of linear fashion. And this is sort of the view, I would say, that Francis Crick made so emphatically in his various books. The Scientific Meaning of Emergent, or at least the one I used, assumes that while the whole may not be the simple sum of the separate parts, its behaviors can, at least in principle, be understood from the nature and behavior of its parts, plus the knowledge of how these parts interact. That's the story. You get that story, and you've got the story of how brain relates to mind. Or as Richard Feynman said it more simply, I think you can't say A is made of B or vice versa. All mass is interaction. So it's just that interaction of those parts, and that's the full. There's no downward causation. There's none of that stuff that other people talk about. Or as David Lewis, philosopher, put it, think of a dot matrix printer. Nothing changes in the apprehension of what gets printed out that actually isn't represented on the page. For every neuronal change, there's a corresponding mental event. If there's a mental change, there's a corresponding underlying neural event. Now that's contrasted with the notion of supersede, which is that the brain, of course, again, produces mind. No one's arguing that point, anything else than that. But that the mind has its own status, which can then constrain the very brain or the very mechanisms that produced it. And this view gives rise to the notion that the whole system is a layered system, which I'll come back to in a minute. This view was pushed by my mentor, Roger Sperry, starting in the late 60s. And he put it this way: a molecule is the master of its inner atoms and electrons. The latter are hauled and forced around in chemical interactions by the overall configurational properties of the whole molecules. Similarly, when it comes to brains, remember always that the simplest electric, atomic, molecular, and cellular forces and laws, though still present and operating, have all been superseded in brain dynamics by the configurational properties of higher level mechanisms. At the top, in the human brain, these include the powers of perception, cognition, memory, reason, judgment, and the like. So Sperry wanted to say that there are emergent things that come out, that those properties become part of the causal chain that ultimately control. These things are like, as he mentions there, perception, cognition, memory, beliefs, and all the rest. How does that come about? How does that work? Let's get specific. Well, a couple of minutes on this. This comes out of research that I did along with Roger in the early days on studying these patients who've had their brains divided in an effort to control their epilepsy. For those of you who don't know this, I don't know where you've been for the last 50 years, but for a quick primer, if everybody in the room looks at that screen and looks at the dot between the words key and ring, and I ask you what you see, you would say you saw the words key and ring. However, if Itzhak decides that you're epileptic and cuts your corpus callosum, a different story emerges, that now the left brain is disconnected from the right, and what you have is a situation where information that gets projected directly to the left brain, which is your language speech center, you can normally name information presented to the right brain. You now deny being present. So a split brain patient would say in response, what do you see? They would say, I see the word ring. Yet at the same time, they could put their hand underneath a table where a bunch of objects are and retrieve the appropriate action, because that touch information goes to the silent right hemisphere and the sensory and motor information can be put together for the right solution. So that's the basic split brain phenomenon. Now what's interesting is what we discovered 25 years later about how the brain interprets, how the brain comes to understand all the behaviors that these sort of separated areas, which then just becomes a metaphor for unconscious areas, behave. And this was a simple experiment we did that reveals it. So again, you look at that picture, you fixate the dot in between the chicken leg and the snow scene, and if I showed you that picture, you would say, well, I see a snow scene and a chicken leg. Split brain patient would say, I see a chicken leg, because the snow scene is going to the isolated right hemisphere that doesn't speak, and so forth. Well, after 25 years, instead of asking the patient what they see, we set up this kind of test where each hand could respond to what the question that it was being queried. So here, of course, the left brain is being shown the picture of the chicken claw, and it controls the right hand, so it picks the most appropriate object, which is, of course, the picture of the chicken. And the right brain is seeing the snow scene, and it controls the left hand, and the left hand is going out there, and it's pointing to the most closely related object, the shovel. So the patient responds just like you see in the cartoon. And finally, 25 years later, we got around to asking the questions to the patient. So Paul, why did you do that? And Paul says, oh, that's simple. This is the left hemisphere talking now, right? The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and then looking down at his left hand, he says, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. And the reasoning being that here's a behavior that's produced, it's coming out of your body. You have to explain that behavior. It has to have meaning to you, and you quickly put into your narrative a reason why your hand did that. And over the years, this became the model that we really have this interpreter mechanism in our left hemisphere. We know it's isolated to the left hemisphere, lots of studies on that. And you really have all these other systems that we're capable of having in our brain, other systems, nonverbal systems that are able to produce behavior, whether they're mood states, whether they're actual behaviors. They come pouring out of us. They're felt states inside. And this interpreter all the time is giving a justification, an interpretation, building it into the story of your moment-to-moment life. So this leaves us with a model that while we know we have these various levels of organization in our brains, they lead to this mental capacity that we love and enjoy. But also, if we're going to believe in this supersede model, that those mental systems can constrain the very brain that built it. But what's interesting to consider is that, of course, what the brain is, our human brain in particular, is really interested in is social process. It's relating to others. It's finding out the intentions of others. And this picture wonderfully shows that here we have a contrast between the sole psychological person calculating the body dead there and the other soldier taking care of his wounded comrade. So we've come to understand that's really a social, the brain is probably built, probably 99% of the brain is built to carry out and process social information. And so the social layer really constrains the mental layer. Now a classic, so we have another layer on top is what I'm trying to say. We're going to call it the social layer. And now you have all forms of dynamic interactions between the social state we all live in, through the mental, through the brain processes itself. I'm going to give you a concrete example of this classic from experimental psychology. It was a study by the social psychologist Richard Nisbett, where he took two cultures. He took Americans and he took Asians, and he showed them the simple picture you see here. And Americans focus on the big fish. You show them this picture and you ask them later on what they saw, and they say, well, they saw a big fish, and that's revealed through a number of ways. As where the Asians, when they looked at the same picture and were asked what they saw, they talk about the relationship between the objects. They don't talk about the big fish. And so this is a cultural difference that actually comes to impact on the actual perceptual mechanisms. You would think it would all be universal, but in fact it's not. And just a couple of years ago, these, turns out by John Gabrielli and others at MIT, they studied this and found out that there's a wonderful brain correlate of this, that when the absolute task is up there trying to figure out what's just there, the Asians find their brain working very hard, as you can see on the right, whereas the Americans give that no challenge at all, and their brains works real hard when they're trying to figure out the relative positions of objects. So you can see then that I want to argue that there is this, there are these mechanisms by which the beliefs can deepen. There's this social network which can impact the mental network, where those social phenomena can have an impact on the belief systems and a mechanism for how they can be deepened. And these well-known psychosocial forces which are involved and listed as involved commonly in all kinds of genocide, as I read the literature, have many, many avenues in to explain how these horrendous behaviors, I think, could be established. So finally then, what's all this mean? And this gets to my last point about, given all this, and we're not even at the beginning of the race about how the brain enables all of the cognitive, perceptual, social phenomenon that we experience. We know it's there. We're working on it. People are working hard. People get worried we're working too fast. But it's all happening. I want to make the argument for those who are interested in what this means in terms of the concepts of personal responsibility. Don't worry. It means nothing, because the notion of personal responsibility isn't in the brain. The notion of personal responsibility comes from the social context within which we live. And my argument would go like this. We have no problem seeing that that little pocket watch is automatic. We have no problem whatsoever, in fact, count on the fact that every cell in our body works in an automatic way. We tend to go nuts when the argument is made that our brains are automatic too. They're going to be understood in these mechanistic terms that neuroscientists are pushing. But I would say just hold on, because you got to remember that all those interactive automatic brains function in a social context. And it's the social context where we try to find the rules that are responsible for our orderly behavior in a social group. That's where responsibility lies. So I would say it's the stuff in the social layer, and responsibility arises out of people, not brains. A metaphor here that tries to capture this level of analysis approach. Cars are automatic. Analysis of traffic cannot be achieved by studying cars in isolation. A new set of laws govern how all those automated, physically determined cars, or scooters as we say,
Backed by a popular demand, here's some more traffic footage. The last footage I showed, it was...
Anyway, you get the idea. Brains are automatic. Analysis of brains cannot illuminate the capacity or responsibility, a dimension of life that comes from social exchange rules. So here's the point. Brains are determined. It's people, however, that are responsible. The whole notion of being personally responsible has no meaning if there's only one person on Earth, right? It's the deal that starts getting cut when there's two of you, and let alone 7 billion. So, so finally then, to feed into the next talk, sentencing and punishing, will neuroscience come in and play even a larger role? Will provide mitigating information like I suggested at the beginning with psychopaths? I certainly think it will. And what do we do with this social decision, and when as that information comes in? That's a societal choice. I just want to say, let's let the legal system determine if the person is responsible for the act in question. Yes. Then what do we do about it? These are social decisions that each of us, as a society and a group, will make. Do we want to treat it? Do we want to forgive it? Should we keep the people sequestered? What are we going to do? That's the job of the next speaker. Thank you.